Hello everyone, today we talk about the development of late medieval and early modern uniforms, a topic that we already discussed here and there, especially as far as the 18th century is concerned, and the relics of, in fact, traditional identitary clothing in fact, up to actually contemporary times, when you look at some, not just at parade uniforms, but also certain features here and there, feathers, other. The entire history of warfare is characterized by a very strong identitary meaning and presentation to boost the esprit de corps, but also to terrorize the enemy. And there is an aesthetics of dread that is functional, is a tool used to intimidate the enemy and increase your own morale, just in the way you look and you present yourself to the enemy. This is really instinctive. It gets down to human biology, and it's very fascinating to observe how civilizations and cultures develop this in military history. Naturally, our preferential pool of information is Europe, given the overwhelming amount of information, to say the least, and the fact that we can sort of connect much of what we will see today with sort of our current mentality as well. That, as we've seen in this video, it's not far from the original one, right? It's just a sort of illusion, right, of very scarce depth, by the way, that has been weaved, fabricated in the last couple of centuries, but all the archetypal meaning, all the symbols, and more are living within that, right? And much of it is universal, of course, but I think it's always mind-opening when you figure out how certain specific, let's say, icons that you sort of grew up with, even just, if you were fascinated with toy soldiers like I was as a kid, like how much of what you see and what sort of could elevate in spirit at the time, in terms of looking at these figures and say, oh, how cool are they, right? They inspire me, like this color, this uniform, this feature here has something that I like aesthetically as well, right? And the aesthetics of war, this idea of the beautiful and the terrible at the same time, is pretty much at the basis of our especially virile archetype, not only, but the hero, of course, is also the one that has to bring down the terrible in order to tame it, control it, and transfigure itself, right? Just banally, the etymology of terrible stands for terra, for essentially the earthly, the fallen dimension, so everything concerning same horrid as well, the earth, the blood, the decomposition, like the sense that the fear of death, the fear of finity, of mortality that the earth embodies as the fallen world that mankind has created by incarnating the celestial world and making its same divinity falling right to this lows, right? So of course all this beautiful terrible has to do with the capacity to transcend your own mortality in battle, and this is the actual meaning of this symbol. And uniforms historically are those models that fundamentally serve in ways that we can't individually ascend in, because it would in this video require an enormous research and just probably the things that likely haven't quite been studied yet, right? Uniformology is a sort of thing, but there is I doubt that it's ever been studied in depth, right? And especially connected with the art of war, as far as the traditional meanings in a spiritual, religious fashion are concerned. And so one could speculate, even looking at these, and not just uniforms in the modern sense, but basically the outfit of the warrior in general, the fighter, how that would, case by case, be functional to that specific reality. And of course it encompasses moral dimension that in fact is impossible sort of to quantify, but this is the point when you look at even just art per se, well, not just uniforms or military related topics, but generally speaking the archetypes are always sort of there in terms of, at least of conflict, of struggle. You have to make this effort to at least try to think how much you recognize of that from your own cultural background, and trying to imagine on the basis of your historical knowledge what could that specific characteristic mean, right? A specific feature mean in that historical context. That is to say, the way a classical Hellenic hoplite would go at war, that we observed multiple videos. We made, for example, recently something about the hoplitic shield blazons, right, and all the religious, mythological symbolism on it and more. Like, what did they trigger in these people? Like, what did it mean to go at war with these symbols, right? Is this sort of clearer to a degree with banners, with something that was meant to encompass the army as a whole to some extent? This can be even found in military music, but it's also important to understand down the line, like, what the individual, the final rank soldier would think of this thing as well. And I think this is an incredibly fascinating topic. Of course, you cannot fully reconstruct it, because those meanings and feelings and mentalities have been lost, unfortunately. But you can try to make an effort to understand how multisensorial history really was, let's say, the past cultures really were properly by self-cultivation, in fact, as cultures, and how much of that sort of being lost, like music being part, for example, of a broader religious experience that encompassed all aspects of life, or many other, I don't know, something that arrived to us in terms of literature, for example, or mythology. To us, it's very lay and secular in the way we at least teach them, but the actual meanings at the time, and this is something we address in Schwerpunkt often, were deeply different, and you have to dig a lot in order to sort of bring them to life. All right. So today we will frame this within a, let's say, some other topics that we observed recently. For example, we talked about early modern uniformation connected with the Catholic Protestant mindset, right? Why this happened politically, strategically, in different ways, what philosophies were behind that. Also, we can connect it with the, again, the explicit sort of exceptions, right? Think about things like, I don't know, the kills, the claymore, the Totenkopf, the mirliton, the hussars of death. I mean, something that even in actually more recent times, where you think that those guys in the 18th century were all uniformed fantassin without sort of these older relics of the past. This is the Enlightenment version of the story, the Illuministic version of the story in a negative way. But actually, they were still believing deeply into those set of values. I mean, even the Napoleonic armies, even the French ones, stemming from the pre-imperial republican background, that technically had to be a sort of Jacobine communistic sort of, in fact, belief. I don't know. Look at a grenadier of the old guard, right? It's, you know, they're so close to an ancient warrior in many ways, not because they are, right? Don't never make the childish mistake of considering soldiers as warriors. Warriors are something else. They belong to a dimension in history that, admittedly, never eliminable, is integrated with something that actually makes the greater power of civilization on them. And this is a topic which perhaps we can address with some example here, but that is, in fact, must understand what's the role of the warrior, even just in military history, and not just because, I don't know, modernity or secular thought arrive, right? The most effective armies are the ones who blend modernity and tradition but they have to do it in an effective way in the first place, right? You must understand what those are, and there is an incredible disorientation. This, like siding with culturally underdeveloped countries for self-sabotaging your greater civilization, is of course, the hallmark of a personal inferiority. But today, it's extremely common. And when you explain these topics, like, the first thing people tend to think like is that, right? Instead, that's the most animal-like, the one that truly is being crushed, in fact, under the heels of soldiers in history in many ways. And because the warrior is not like, is an elite guy in a backward society that cannot do more than that, right? Because it lacks collective training to a degree which has not been able eventually to sort of increase this let's say, metaphysical force within say, all across society. This is particularly important because there are peoples who rise and fall that are, in that sense, more powerful and sometimes in history than of course, than the moment in which they decline. And while it is true that the Fantasant didn't have anything of the level of individualistic capacity of a warrior, this is self-evident also still in colonial conflicts, right? This doesn't mean that, of course, the underdeveloped was crushed, because, of course, failed under the same tradition that was professed by those cultures. The others had been better, because even though we don't like to see it like this, at least, I don't have a problem with it, but in general, like, from the conservative side of the aisle, I perceive this sort of hostility towards the concept of civilization to occur, and this basically just confuses cultural underdevelopment with traditional value and spiritual power. That's a completely different story. There are two different threads, right? They can intertwine, but it's not the case. That's why it's never a simplistic dichotomic answer, right? But there would be that's why we have to talk also more about modern warfare, because that exemplifies it much better in a sense than ancient and medieval history, when you already find it actually to some great degree. Like, it's von Clausewitz is extremely clear. We've seen it, the Filmkriege, concerning the what he calls literally the savage peoples, the wild peoples. And he explains why did they go down, why that's absolutely normal, and why, of course, the power of a civilization obviously stems from the traditional element that is part of it, maybe residual in the individual, but put together in a more effective way by mass, surely superior to those other systems. And so never give it for granted. In any case, I think that starting from what we said about Protestant military ethics and the extremely harsh discipline that this entailed, and the fact that, of course, this was pretty much, I also discussed this recently in the video about the classical influence on the making, for example, of the Dutch army of the 80 Years' Wars, things like that, were of course paralleled by the Catholics as well. The concept was, even there, the debate between sort of depriving the soldier of any sort of individual motion, right? This is, in a way, what idealistically the Greeks believed in. There is a passage from the Peloponnesian War in which Thucydides makes it extremely clear that, according to him, at least, as a broader expression of Hellenic mentality of the time, discipline would have been enough, right? If, and this is not wrong in line of theory, because, of course, what the Greeks looked at was always at perfection, in a divine sense, in more or less distant as they could have grown in secular thought, but actually very intensely still at the time, of course, by any standard we have now. And of course, if you accept that God is pure truth and pure reason, of course, absolute subservience to, or actual, belief and motivation in, sacrificing yourself instantly would be perfect, right? And would immediately bring the individual to essentially back to the one, but not in the, sarcastic sense of that he would get killed. On the contrary, that Athena is like that. Athena is, cold, cold-blooded. She always beats Ares, which is in fact a warrior that is inferior to her in every single engagement. Ares in Hellenic mythology is like the dumb son that his parents are legitimately disappointed by, and explicitly so in the mythology. And of course proves the superiority of civilization in that. However, this was also a very idealistic idea that is the same reason why the Greeks were taken over by the Romans, that were of the same advice. Of course, they had actually a much more traumatically brutal discipline than the Greeks. But they knew that by sheer experience, at that point in history, like centuries of extremely radical, extreme brutality against the Italic warrior to make it become a Roman legionnaire, that you could never extirpate warriorism, like individualism in a sense, but you had to, in order to actually, that would have been, first of all, impossible, but it would have been also counterproductive, but you could essentially elevate that to soldiery by channeling it within that level of fallen dimension that humanity always has, also in combat, but to the benefit of a collective functionality, right? And that's why the Roman legionnaire was, of course, shockingly trained in a collective sense, but also, a person who literally, was bloodthirsty, and of course, just first of all, of course, thinking that they were Superman of some sort, and that they could absolutely slaughter anything and anyone that would be in front of them without any problem. But in that sense, bloodthirsty, like individualistic to an extent. This is reflected beautifully by the same Roman armament, and in general by Roman warfare. This is something that we have analyzed in some videos, but it is something that, you see, that the Romans believed that that discipline was a thing. They had to learn themselves, but you could not extirpate the virtus, because the virtus encompassed that higher awareness that the individual had to sacrifice to the degree that would allow that collective superiority to crush, in fact, those who had not arrived there, culturally speaking, right? And this is the actual meaning of what we're talking about today. So when you look, for example, at the Prussian army of the 70 Years' War, we're pretty much in the same field. And you'd be surprised by how actually, even in the Middle Ages, like how intense discipline really was. And in fact, I would like to point out one aspect here is that, first of all, 18th century discipline was also traumatic. We know that, and it's also much better documented time. We do not know too much, unfortunately, about actual discipline in medieval or ancient times. But we just know it was there because if you study the art of war, this in a diachronic and comparative way, you can appreciate that, of course, if a unit on the field behaved in a certain way, it's because they had received a certain amount of training and were kind of good at that. In fact, medieval armies were particularly and highly trained. If you actually look at them in the history of civilization in relative terms, there is an incredibly negative bias towards medieval armies. There is a lot of trash videos on YouTube to say, why were medieval armies so small? What didn't, there was so this. I don't know whether, these people have actually ever studied medieval warfare. It's a rhetorical question. Of course, they haven't. But the point is that they don't even understand that in the ancient world, that even if you make the point that there were smaller armies than larger ones on a regular basis, that's actually normal. It's normal even today, if we talk strategically. But let's leave aside also this, because, all right, I prefer not to digress because just people complain that I ramble a lot, but this is actually the sap of it all, right? If you do not confront yourself with this problem, and the fact that discipline was trying to fix essentially the fallen nature of mankind, you can't quite appreciate what even these powers were fighting for, what a Frederick the Great would have really had in his mind in terms of actual tradition. People called this the enlightened sovereignty, right, of absolutism. They weren't nor absolute, nor especially sort of enlightened in the liberal sense sovereigns at all. Actually, these guys were topping the after an important while the attempt in fact establishing that collective order on the basis of values that had been depleted over the centuries just by the continuous degeneration of mankind. And so these efforts give rise to some good traditional value, but also they are like breaking the cord of a weaker humanity. And so you have the French Revolution coming out, and so there's actually cheapening of the individual soldier in many ways, but also the awakening of some sort of absolute force that is substance to which you have at least to give a form. And all in all, even the history of revolutionary and imperial France tell you how, of course, revolutions are clumsy. They sort of, those who make them practically are sinking, and they actually don't improve the situation. But the general power that this confirmed to civilization was grounded on an actual tradition. Is this what we observed in the video about the Battle of Austerlitz, the final comments of the Ancien Regime rulers on Napoleon, that was described literally by the Russian Tsar as a man sent by heaven. So it's not that, yes, the Tsar was a bit sort of a Napoleon's fan to a degree, but not to the extent that he was actually embracing revolutionary ideas. Also, Napoleon had, as you know, quite conveniently mitigated change in that regard. But it was recognized in tradition because there is no other explanation in tradition, and if there is not supposed to be in the first place, of the fact that there is no such thing like power on earth without actual matching of traditional divine values of standard, right? So you may have a very well-formed system in the Ancien Regime with various cases, etc., but it could become sclerotic in that form if you do not substantiate it, if you keep it, not exploiting the human potential that is always divine, its spark. So you have the French Revolution, for example, is very clumsy formally, but releases all the substance that manages to overwhelm also those better powers that actually crumble. So it's important to study history in this regard and not always, again, to pick, because, again, it's very easy to say, this is one color and its opposite. No, right? It's not even about a blend. It's that there are other colors, and you must understand how they combine, right? And to the infinite of possibilities, that's what actually God actually is about. And there was already in the 18th century some protest, and not even from the soldiery that had always done so in terms of this incredibly harsh discipline, right? Of course, there were lots of deserters at the time, also because the state was not so controlling yet. Many were exemplarily punished when captured. Others managed to get away. But we will talk perhaps better about that dynamic in 18th century armies, because it's also documenting a bit how more universal the system really was, aside from the national powers that people sort of just focus categorically and rigidly on without getting the entire picture. So during the 7 Years' War, you have a great commander and also military writer, Christoph Zalda, that was a Russian general, and one of the most rigorous asserters of that extremely violent discipline that the Prussians had, and that was functional to, again, essentially this emerging power that was surrounded by the greatest ones in Europe at the time, and that had necessarily to rely on this incredibly enhanced discipline. Just because they were terribly pressured, this would have not been enough militarily either, right? If it hadn't been for the so-called miracles of the House of Brandenburg. But you could make the case that, if war is a continuation of politics without a means, that's still, at the political root, some sort of divine blessing, in fact, in traditional recognition. And this, complaint of his towards the harshness of discipline, and especially the concept that soldiers sometimes are better won morally with understanding than with terror, stems from the, I would say, not just to the extremes of Prussian unspeakable violence, but the realization, especially again in a power like that lays essentially again in an open ground, even just say geographically at the boundary of the major powers like Russia, Austria, and France, that the best way to enhance the further potential of the troops in general was to not cheaply brutalizing them only, which would have been continued to be done because that also works, but also making them sort of understanding, sort of participating to the let's say to for example to decision making. I mean, Prussian doctrine would develop, especially after the Napoleonic War, on the concept of you must give more autonomy to the officers, for example, because you can't simply caging them into a set of direct orders from the superior that should know everything about the battlefield, while the actual guy who is there is much better informed than him. And so that degree of trust and faith in the divine spark within the human that could give some important results, which again doesn't mean, as I just said, that okay, let's make the soldiers do whatever they want. No, they must be absolutely brutalized and terrorized, but they must be in a measure that is functional to what you want to achieve with them, right? And it would be extremely interesting considerations to make. I have all a theory on certain specific issues that are very sensitive. I'm not aware whether I can talk them on YouTube, but I've been watching in my life a lot of veterans interviews, and there are some, I think, self-evident dynamics going on psychologically that are part of our culture rather than a sort of abstract deterministic human nature, right? And a war must be understood, and I believe that there is an enormous misunderstanding regarding what trauma consists of, especially. But again, I can't, just for legal reasons, not talk about it. I mean, I would normally talk, I surely can make some videos about these with the due care and preparation, but that's simply not today's topic, right? But it's, I think, extremely important. And this principle of giving trust is all one with, for example, the spirits of the, even if these differ to some important degree, of the American and French Revolution. Especially the former. I think the Constitution of the United States is one of the most beautiful ones in history, together with the Swiss one and the one of Liechtenstein. The French one has some problems, definitely ingrained, but you must understand it from the specific, in fact, background of French history, what the monarchy had represented, and in fact the degree of, in fact, elevation of the individual that existed conceptually there, as opposed to, say, New England, in fact. And the idea is that, at least the good idea is that you should, of course, this is the passage, I'll make a video about this, the passage from the subject / military servant to the citizen soldier, right? The idea is that as a citizen soldier, which turns out historically to be the single most homicidically effective in war, is involving, if you want, the individual in the cause for which he has to fight, right? It's just like about the United States rising to top world power, right? There are all problems with the American way to tradition, which is incredibly rooted in empiricism, and it misses a dramatic, really important theoretical element to that, which is the cause why if things go well, you have this force, yes, but eventually if things go wrong, you may hit the rocks harder, which is, I think, what is happening today, even though I actually have a great sympathy for the true spirit of the United States of America. And we will perhaps make a video also on that, right? We'll have the various problems in our national backgrounds and ways to tradition, right? And of course, there are better and worse. But the sense, especially there, is the fact that if you know what you're fighting for and you have a, broader understanding of the Clausewitzian trinitary, say, declension of your peculiar, in fact, political, military, and social situation, you would better understand why sacrificing yourself, right? If you are just a scared peasant that is being co-opted violently into an army, as it was normal in the 18th century, we have seen the press gangs, we've seen, there were even admirals that rose to the top, but in general, that's not the best recipe, right? It's just forcing people into the regiments, also for actually getting, there was all a speculation behind that, as you know, for the licenses, for the pays that made, so more people in, at least at the beginning, and the better. But this sucked, right, as soldiers. It was just, in war there is a good enough, right? So obviously in warfare the standards are always lower than it should be. But it's the direction, and in fact the form, that really matters when you look at the substance that you have in your hands. And so, even though, and I will make a video about this, for example, the American Revolution was, in many ways, aside from the fact that, of course, the European intervention decided the outcome, let's say, if you look at the actual colonists' sort of broader awareness, was incredibly scarce. I mean, barely anyone had an idea of what even, the struggle was about, right? The only thing is that they didn't want personally to pay taxes, right? Nor, actually, most Americans could have ever been successfully coerced by the British in doing so. So there was an incredibly varied background in there, but mostly just just a libertarian principle to some extent that was just, I want to be left alone, right? And this works, of course, if you have the entire North America to still colonize, to conquer, to mold, and to exploit, which is a perfectly positive thing, by the way, and I deeply believe in that. But it's not the entire part of the story, right? That's why I was talking about the empiricism just per se. The same goes with the French Revolution. In many ways, that equality was just used to have, in fact, more cannon fodder and still not really responding, say, having a relation with a state that was less tyrannical than the one that had happened under kings. But hey, these countries, and that's what I say, the good enough is concerned. I mean, at the end of the day, the American War of Independence succeeded from the U.S. side because it was enough, right? And France managed to stand on her feet, and even continuing to be the most powerful continental country in Europe. So this is the way history and humanity imperfectly manifest, right? And you have to understand that when you study the military history of these events, there is an ideological, an emotional way you could, for example, involve the soldier, right? You know what I think about the concept of propaganda in general? It's a completely neutral concept, right? Propaganda simply means what has to be propagated, right? And it can be the best ideology, the most neutral, the most effective one. Ideology is not a colored term as well. It's a completely neutral word if you know the etymology and the language that you speak. But people, of course, anti-militarism as pacifism, as also militarism, is an indicator of an imbalancement, right? It's an indicator of a cultural inferiority, of also severe degree, when it's really a constitutive part of a country, together with isolationism and beyond. But it's also relevant to understand how ideology and emotion can be used to bring these soldiers to fight, or at least to join, or to that degree that allows effectively the government to send these guys to get himself killed, right? And it can be actually the best of the reasons, but unfortunately for the average soldier, and also for the Fourth Estate to often complain on this, it lacks the actual, I want to know why I went to die for this war. And the actual outcome, and this is what I learned also from all those veterans interviews, is that it feels like people get betrayed, feel betrayed in part because of this, right? And you can have wars that were actually good fighting for intentionally, that could be won, by the way, that there is no determinism about that, but that since, eventually they are lost, there are wars. This is another concept that I explain in some videos. Wars can be lost literally by everyone, right? There is no such thing like a war is sort of absolutely won or lost, simply because it's a political act. So for a country, maybe winning a war on the field means to destroy itself, right? But there are other wars that could easily be won, that were a small thing, but that sort of impacted for some reason in a moral way, so that even the guys who fought in there, since they don't understand much about politics or history or even the actual war they fought in, because that's the actual point. I mean, getting shot at or seeing people exploding in front of you doesn't have any connection with understanding the strategy of that theater, for example. That's something you must study, you must research, you must be in control of. That's something that the final rank soldier will not understand. Like, war will impact him in a unforgettable way, in a radical way, in a way that gets down to the nerves of existence, but is not substitutive for civilizational capacity, intelligence, rationale, right? That's a complete and actually also much greater strength, right, than you may think. But of course, we live in a society of Fourth Estaters, and so anti-war is like the first thing. Like, there are even moments in which it would truly be good to get into a nuclear holocaust if the odds are certain ones, right? If you still want to make the right thing. This may sound as a nonsensical thing, but the point is that if you get to the point in which you're going either to live in your own degree of liberty or just be lost into tyranny, like, at some point it'd be better even to sacrifice yourself. And if you look at the history of warfare, for what warfare really is, that people really go out there and go not just get themselves killed, but especially go to kill others, and they accept the risk involved in that. That is apparently the scariest thing for anyone, and that makes the person who has not been there, okay, well, I would never do it, is actually how things work. Like, I mean, humans really are programmed to do that, because when you're under that pressure, where you're under, even just there, you can be manipulated also ideologically or emotionally. You will kill. You will get killed. It's not a strange thing. It's not an abnormal thing. It's not an inhuman thing. It's not a barbarian thing. Actually, the greater the civilization, the greater destructive its force. And so, unfortunately, again, we are dominated in a world of culturalism. Think about the same people who teach into military academies that still, of course, have never opened the Franc-archers in their life. They still sell this BS, which is just a sort of post-traumatic disorder in itself, connected to the idea that they're scared at the concept of people dying in war, right? Which is pretty strange, to say the least, if you know what war is, right? So it's not just ideally theoretically, not ideally, theoretically what must be, of course, an act of force designed to aimed at compelling the enemy to fulfill your will. But this, as from Clausewitz, which is of course a Clausewitzian quote, translates itself into is the physical annihilation of the enemy in practice. Right, that's what it practically gets down to. I mean, they virtually overlap. They're not technically the same thing, but that's how the difference between theory and practice and how real history takes shape. Right. So I think this is very important. This step, especially the one again towards mass society with the French Revolution, in order to understand why people do not understand war today. Right, and this is in fact the point that I always make on this channel, that up to that point, people were adamant in understanding why war was being fought. Right, you could, yes, be an alienated forestater of the time already at the time. We know that of course modern soldiery was made up of the scum of the earth, the people that truly did not have an understanding of the world and whatever. But let's say the direct implications of war were much more deeply self-evident in their real outcome than anything that happened later by scale, right? So this is what really changes, like especially the French Revolution, Napoleonic warfare on the political level, the fact that in the name of the cause, whichever it was, you could have asked the troops sacrifices that up to that point in history had not been thinkable. Not because it was actually demanded necessarily more to these guys. It was in relative terms. I mean, getting themselves killed, yes, but understanding less why that was the case, right? It didn't matter to the extent in which these armies were, again, the most powerful ever seen. And so the concept was, yes, soldiers are cheaper. We can have more of them killed, and yet we will actually gain our positive political and strategic goal. So actually it's not an irrational idea. This is a bit like Thucydides' quote before. If you come closer to God in terms of might, like armies have and civilizations have become in the last hundreds of years, you can have them terribly unbalanced or whatever, but indeed, if you are able to use that instrument effectively, well, to your credit, right? What is the other side doing if has not gotten there yet either, right? It's a dangerous game, but it sort of still determines who is the stronger, who is the more morally capable in handling all this much greater machine. Right, and maybe with more sacrifice maybe with less, consideration for the details, for the last elements of the machinery, right? Hence the myth of the butchers, the sense that every single, like the let's say the greater the army, the more effective the mistake in terms of absolute losses. This is true. Right, these systems were not perfect. The military is not perfect. Nobody's perfect. No human being is perfect. But of course, those who are able to see politics and strategy objectively on a larger scale, of course, they are much more deserving and capable than the average final rank soldier that simply does not have the education to realize what the hell that is supposed to mean. This doesn't mean that his sacrifice is not positive or functional, right? This is what triggers me all the time. You hear people, oh my god, we lost so many people during World War I. We didn't have to fight. So what was the alternative? Like letting another power taking over in your stead? What kind of mental illness is this? But they made all these attacks against trenches, and the front remained unchanged for years. Well, because maybe there was somebody else from the other side who was also resisting, and, no, but it was stupid because, a machine gun could take down 100 people at a time. Yes, because, you think, if you look at the offensive casualties on a regional scale, that's 1 to 100. The loss, they're the same scale. They're in the hundreds of thousands from both sides, right? So not understanding anything about the art of war, the connection between tactics and strategy, and especially between strategy and politics, is something that, again, has grown as an entire system of mental alienation among especially fourth estate or lesser people of mass society, right? Before, again, this alienation existed to different extent. Warfare, the paradox of warfare, the apparent paradox of warfare was pointed out, but it was just, a bit the mockery of some aspects of war, the actual recognition of cowardice, right, in front of, or if anything, the best way is political responsibility, right, to go. Like, if you fail, militarily speaking, it's because, somebody beat you. You have to understand why, but also admitting, of course, that you are a lesser people because you're defeated by a greater one is something that people don't want to hear, right? So they have to invent that politics is separated from the people. Again, the 20th century, again, typical lesser people, lack of responsibility, whatever. That's, again, then you wonder why crises happen, why, people get dumber and stupid than they already are, and, dictatorships and totalitarian regimes arise because, again, people delegate, they grow too weak, and they're incapable of handling reality in the first place, so they're rejected entirely. This was diametrically opposite to the entire traditional belief. You must command over the world. This is traditional belief. Because if you're better than anybody else, everything becomes better. Also the others, in the conflict in itself. And so that's the degeneration of mankind along the path. So this is the degree, the actual illusion, right, in the degree of the sacrifice that was really required, right? Warfare in medieval, that's the other BS that, some humanists came up with, the idea that in medieval warfare, there were less losses, medieval warfare was less deadly than, a World War I battlefield. Utter nonsense. I mean, just take a look at what the actual rate of medieval battles losses actually are. I published some on some of these topics as well. We're easily talking about 20, 30, even 40% losses at a point. In major battles, in the original context they studied, but pretty much in all the other battles that I studied, for Europe and beyond, that happens, right? It's a major bloodshed, and yes, that was actually normal, right? The fact that you're taken down, that being disemboweled with a sword, aside from the fact that you can get bayoneted, also in a World War I context, that doesn't tell you anything about the ultimate sacrifice. Like, you can't be taken down by a shell or a machine gun, but still, that's pretty much the same. Right? How do you prefer? It's just like people were against certain types of weapons in general, right? Would you be happier to be gassed or to be shot with a rifle? Because, most people say, I don't know, I want to be shot with a rifle. Really? Because you think that that's better than being gassed? I mean, that's an actual question. This is not rhetorical. This is, how do you think your death could be in the first place, even? I mean, morally or physically. How do you judge that? Surely you can measure that to some extent. There can be research made on this, but in the actual accident, as it happens, right, which is unique in its kind, how do you determine that? How do you think reality goes? A standard pack way of dying, for which you know how it's going to happen eventually on the battlefield, right? Do you think that getting crushed by horse, smashing, breaking your spine during a cavalry charge is sort of, better than being gassed? Well, again, we live in a world that has lost the entire point of using their brain, apparently, because they know better, even. And you can look at that watershed we were talking about before mass society. In other words, 18th century warfare was still based on the sense that there was a leader that was chosen because of his virtue, and you were essentially recognizing your own inferiority, and you were putting himself at his service, and he was offering his protection in a way that he could protect but also nurture you and allow you to rise to his own level. To his own level in the sense of, ideally, not because, of course, the 18th century society was particularly, mobile. but because traditionally, like if he won, you would go up compared to other people of your condition, existential in nature, right? So the full rationalization of the idea wouldn't happen until the French Revolution, right? The idea of properly considering the utmost sacrifice, like for the state, because the state takes essentially the place of God to the degree that every law stems exclusively from the state, at least in the post-revolutionary civil law concept. But this is enhanced in a similar way, actually, in the degree of power that common law has, because civilization evolved more or less at the same stage, in spite of these differences, is happening only at this point. We are basically seen as more individually as less relevant. Also because objectively, countries were getting bigger, were getting more complex, and if they had, it's also more difficult to run them. Actually, it's just a physical equation. I mean, everything gets the bigger, the more complicated, the more expensive, the more energy, the more life you need in order to keep it standing. But if you do so, you succeed in crushing the others and getting much more, right? And people, this is also the other very important thing, is that this could have not happened if the people as a whole hadn't been okay with that. All right, let's debunk this myth that a government, again, is severed from people's will. Right, governments exist exclusively because the decisive moral majority of their people accepts them. Right, and doing nothing is exactly equivalent to letting the person do. Right, also because they use your own resources as well in a way or another. So you're just actually actively contributing to that, even if not directly. Right, but that's again especially what people from inferior cultures normally believe. Like the idea, no, it's politics, it's not my country, sorry, I'm not the problem, my country's not the problem, it's just my government. We are different, it's not like you think. And then of course they repeat the same exact thing the government says. It's surprising how in 30 years what were considered the trash of mankind now are by some trash in our own world are considered the actual normality, because of course trash likes trash. That's always the case. In any case, when we look at the plane of equipment, so we're talking uniforms, in a broader sense, at least military clothing. I have an entire playlist dedicated to this. You find this 300 years between 1500 to 1800, two fundamental changes that had to be a synthesis between discipline and functionality, right? So there are many changes in the appearance of the soldier. Like the first one, you would think, especially from the beginning, was the gradual disappearance of armor, right? The cuirass would remain in some units, as you know, but also as an object for parades, and that, again, some chosen corps did maintain. This allowed, of course, this essentially, together with the increase in, this is what had happened. You see, the men-at-arms had been surpassed by the bigger, already at the time, system of the pike square, right? And as such, of course, there was a new world to redesign, even in terms of fashion. Well, how do you want these guys to look like on the battlefield, right? You have the helmet that, modified, would have survived until our days, actually. Yes, there were times in which it had become obsolete, right? Essentially, from the 18th century, the mid 17th century to the beginning of the 20th. The obvious reason is that you didn't really need helmets anymore by the time you could, the cost of them was superior to to the increasing effectiveness of firepower, so it was better to invest in muskets than in armor. As you know, the beginning of the First World War, there had been a broader realization that shells would have been much nastier, like in terms of, especially for head protection, the most important one in combat. But still today, there is of course military personnel that does not use helmet in quite intense combat as well, but it's always like part of the detail, but of course the trend is clear. The other aspect was, in fact, the invention of the uniform proper. As I was saying, I have been talking military clothing from quite a while on the channel. I have some, tens of videos on that, and maybe not be the single most clicked on content, but I noticed that you'll also get interested into it. I mean, it's cool because you get the chance to see soldiers, the uniforms, whatever. But there is always this moral dimension that I try to approach in those videos to express why you see that uniform, right? And today's video is dedicated in part to this. So the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance had made large use, by the way, of heraldic insignia. This because, again, of course, there was no such thing like a single power, right? Still, this was an ancien regime. The modern era did not really exist, right? That's what I always say. The Middle Ages leads straight to until 1792 or 1919, depending on the places. And the idea is that the armies are still the product of a political and social system that is made up by, yes, there is a state that is forming in a concentrated fashion. And so you have the public authority, but also you have the communal ones, you have the circumscriptional ones, the guilds. You have single families that actually make a war a personal business. And it would be interesting to digress and just think about the Polish Szlachta, for example, and how they regarded their own prerogatives, still in the sense of we are free men, we don't really owe anything to anyone. We are at least entrenched with privileges because they're not just free, but we are noblemen, so other people are worthless. We do what we want in our land. And they had their own private armies and whatever. Bishops had them. So there is a very interesting relic of Middle Ages there, even to some important military effectiveness degree, by the way, at least until the 18th century. And so you have an incredible variety of colors. Like what I was noticing when collecting the pictures to make this video is how, aside from the obvious difference in colors, the uniformation, the base of countries or whatever, so the agglutination, that sort of statal uniformity, how truly different. I mean, still today, right? The insignia, the emblems, just the stories of the various military units really are, right? They really are a testament to their raison d'être, aside from just the necessity of recognizing themselves in tournament or in battle, right? So you have a degree of symbolism that is progressed. I made a video, for example, on the shield designs from the Bayeux tapestry. And I remember, normally if you search on that topic, they will tell you, well, no, these are just, random designs. There was nothing heraldic about that. Actually, that was something, heraldry is something born in the modern era. That's true, but that's not, it is because it was growing distant from the actual meaning of those symbols, and that's why they needed to write it down, right? In the 11th century, a Norman horseman would have had an incredible awareness of the symbol that it was bearing to a degree that today we have completely forgotten, but also we don't recognize anymore having existed, which is the worst, perhaps. So there is a wide pool of symbolism they could derive from. On the other, there is, and this is inextricably connected to it to an extent, the aesthetical one and the effect that it had on you and on the enemy at the same time, right? It's not just the deterrence towards the enemy, but it's truly what you were, right? Because in part it is faking, in part it is at least, of course, still a material gear that you are using in order, sometimes even in a impractical way, or at least in a way that would have not made a difference, right, if used or not. It's not that today's soldiers, for example, would be less scary with a plume or something. Is that at least their degree of power individually is far superior, just in terms of deterrence, to a degree also that is, of course, mutual, meaning that you have to cope with the enemy one, and so that's how uniforms also evolve, right? Think about the mimetic, and how that is, of course, connected with essentially rifled barrels and especially automatic machine guns, right? There is, historically, like in the 19th century, for arriving essentially to the point where we are now, there's a practical reason. But also aesthetics wants his thing, because it has to make you look cool, and it has to make you look scary from the other side, right? And this goes in parallel, as I was saying at the beginning, with how you framed all this, with the sound of military instruments, war cries, blazons, colors, really have the purpose of giving a sort of comfort and courage to the friends and inspiring terror within the enemy. This is one of the single most important aspects of them all. And the reason why uniforms are all different in this regard is the degree of declension of the fall of mankind. And in a sense, the struggle that exists in the pieces of mankind left, that have to prove how their own way is the best way to God, right? If you wonder what politics really is, where it gets down to, international competition, wars, whatever, it has to do with essentially at least the degree by which you attach yourself to something so actually fallen, like even the flag of a country, because that's nothing, in front of God, just ipso facto, not just because you would deserve God. You should become God in order to deserve that, and God doesn't need to wave a flag, which is a symbol of division. It's a symbol of the fall, right? In God, everything is one. There's no such thing, like everything is perfect. There's no such thing like different countries that battle over each other, right? And so a part of this is how you have to justify this dynamic. If you go back in history, like what you notice is that everything looks, of course, less different, because it's more primitive, right? And so it's the concept of mankind is sort of prevails, and that's what's the ultimate meaning of the struggle is. The fact that you have all these tools to fight war is just a proof of the degree of weakness that you have achieved, because you can't rely on your mere divine potential to actually alter the world and to fix it in God's image, right? So this is a part also in which the aforementioned fourth estate was convinced that, again, they are relevant because they belong to a country rather than another. This is not to say that the countries are not one better than the other, better or worse than the other, but they're not the absolute standard, right? There is an incredible degree of moral relativism to that. Nationalism is notoriously the first step towards socialism, because it convinces you that just being part of a group gives you inherent equality of value, right? Which immediately the next step is, I want to be parasitically fed by the state, and eventually it degenerates into communism, right? In the Ancien regime, in the true tradition, of course, what matters is what you do and what you achieve and how you change the world in your own image if you manage to reach a divine standard, right? So all this is a sort of patch that civilization put on in order to hide, to distract from the misery of its foe. It's always a dual meaning, right? The reason why we love uniforms is also positive, because the uniform, in fact, essentially tries to, in fact, erase that degree of misery that the average human has. Everybody looks alike. That is alike what should be a higher standard, right? So you can think that that standard, in fact, is not God per se, but it sort of inspires to become more, right? And this is a bit, in fact, the challenge that civilization has been to these patches to still try to put things together to bring it to a higher level after all. So the uniform acquires that transfiguring capacity, right? When you wear one, you truly know that you're a different person, that it gives you power. It gives you something that you have never felt, right? Just like receiving orders, being part of a unit, undergoing training. The military really transforms you to an incredible degree, and actually the military has a higher IQ than the average population. There is all something that, of course, is valuable in the military. It's the respect that it inspires, right? In fact, the fear that it inspires, because what's fear, what's scary in a piece of cloth, really? It's not about that. It is what that means in a spiritual sense. What it means you're prepared to sacrifice just because you are part of that, right? The fact you're going to slaughter your enemies in large numbers just because you've undergone that training and you know you can do it. And that's why the motivation behind it is beautiful, because you have a clear view of what your mission is in the world. And some people, and it always requires a sacrifice, right? To an utmost extent. There are, of course, no person is perfect, and this is not to say that the military, like any other field, is not populated by idiots, by the majority. That's absolutely evident. You can even, and you should actually also separate the sacrifice of these people from their actual persons. I mean, and this is controversial, but of course it depends on what kind of value do you think these people are fighting for. And if you ask the general population, that's not entirely understood. It's not entirely clear. You would think it would be for the highest of the values, but in that sense, we wouldn't be, let's say, even having, as we were saying before, countries or armies or this kind of division if we actually reach that transcendental level of divinity. So it's always debatable, but again, it can be seen as a medium. It can be seen as a point in time, and in fact, studying the history of uniforms, even chronologically, shows you how, if you want, that word changes. I mean, it's like, I don't know, reading how script changes in manuscripts, in paleography. Just when you look at the Gothic script, you can't avoid to see the Gothic cathedrals behind that, just like you can't avoid to see a 13th century knight in his armament behind that. So these are all things that, especially when they get down to aesthetics, and these are just the example, everything has, right, a script, architecture, a uniform, if you can't call it in this way for that time. And you must reflect on it. It's an important aspect. It's about what this can evoke you visually, because, by the way, the idea of intimidating the enemy is founded on the enemy's weakness, right? The ancient myths tell us that essentially those who are scared at the sight of things are weak in general, right? And that's why a soldier should never be scared of anything, because he's going to see literally the goriest, most disgusting, most traumatic, most violent, more shocking things ever, and he has to be the guy who has to go through that literal hell, but still being functional that way. And that's the highest level, if you want. There are other, you may think of this in different ways, but the idea of showing this exemplifies a bit the dualism of man. The fact of showing chthonic symbols, why, for example, in fact, pursuing an Apollonian one, it's, as we were saying before, going in parallel by being able to, say, wield a shield with a Medusa face, for example, that has to petrify the opponent, but you being the guy who actually wields the head of the Medusa, because you have already passed through that through military training. We've seen how actually this chthonic Uranian say mix and relation is present in the warband initiations and similar things. It's all part of this great game. That's like a camaraderie. There are all some stages. This is an initiatory rite in many ways, and there are different stages. Think about the ranks. Think about the responsibilities that are entrusted to you. And of course, anthropology has showed pretty unequivocally all this. I mean, starting from traditional warrior cultures in the West, when you see, I don't know, we can't dig really at this point in history as far as you can, to some extent at least, but say from the Homeric era onwards, the concept of beautiful/terrible is truly the ideal point of arrival of warrior aesthetics, right? And which is a form of masking, right? It is vile in part. I mean, we shouldn't hide ourselves behind this. It's really the point. Before, in the true traditional ancestral worlds, you have the the eye of Ra that is able to mold the world just by opening itself and wanting and immediately actualizing the self in the process and ruling over the world. This is the divine standard, right? And that doesn't need anything, at least everything material has been transcended at that point, so that it's not there, but it's been brought back to the one already. So uniforms can be seen as a tool to just give courage to somebody who doesn't have it, for example. But also to habituate him to that deal, because you cannot, as we explained in the video about the way of the left hand, again, pretend to, getting on a battlefield without training and succeeding. You must expose yourself to the darkest of experiences so that you know how to handle them, right? And military training just per se is never enough compared to combat experience, so you can imagine also how uniforms are almost irrelevant to that aim. But there is still something about that. There is still something about the connection between the military and politics and society that revolves around this, that spirits the military itself, that sees that are watching in that way. So all our feats of heroism, of what we look up to and we admire in history, in our world, it is there, right? There is no doubt that war basically is the most important testing ground of humanity in that regard. And for reasons that are evidently the fact that war is the human activity that has the highest at stake and that can be positively managed in spite of the highest degree of unpredictability. So in other words, you are sacrificing yourself for the higher good with the less chance of succeeding positively, penalty having no chance at all, because otherwise everybody just would walk over you as a carpet. Of course, politics is more important, but you can argue that war is a testing ground, because either there is a clash of wills or there is a collapse of civilization. You have to take matters in your own hand also violently, and you must know how to handle that. There is all a preparation that is just for all the anti-war movements being ridiculous in as much as they are against war, and not the contingent as in itself, and not the contingent political reason why that war is fought, right? Which can be wrong, but it can also be right. We've seen, I don't know, I made, for example, a video on, we talked the Swiss infantries. Sometimes we made a video about the Landsknecht's dress. The fast of the colors in that case is particularly self-evident. We explained how this corresponded to a sort of scum of the world emergence as actually above the fourth estate, because they were considered like a military class, at least in the imperial soldiery, that was even feared by the noblemen, then eventually declined because Germany, of course, was ruled by the nobility. But throughout the 16th century, these were effective troops. If you want, you see, in that case, the arbitrium in the ornaments, right? There was some Spanish fashion originally into the Landsknecht's dress. This was true, especially for the imperials. Eventually, it sort of spread also as part of other fashion influence, but it sort of represented that variety of the humus, right? That's particularly important to service, because a nobleman would have never gone around like that. It would have been a greater containment, right? And they, especially the nobility at that point, fought in armor, not much in flamboyant colors. And there is all a meaning behind this. It's never random. It's never like, oh, look, these guys, they wore in this way for no reason. No, they were making an express political statement with that kind of clothing, right? It was a sort of classist revanchism in a country that had been witnessing from a millennium just people belonging to someone else, and so now having the right to bear arms in the name of the empire and the public authority was really galvanizing them, to the point even of danger. These people were violent, also at home, etc. They were they were disobedient. They wanted their pay. They didn't care so much, after all, as long as they got paid regarding the cause, right? So that was true a bit for everybody, telling the truth. But this is for saying that also that the political allegiance is always shaded depending on the circumstance. And in those cases, if you think about that, aside from the psychologically deterrent element that could be for the enemy seeing himself assailed by warriors sort of clad like fighting cocks, right? The need from which the uniform would have eventually been born, that is actually a minimal, or at least a lesser collective cost from one side, and necessity of immediately recognizing the soldier from another, had in fact a few to do with a world of mercenaries that armed and clothed themselves individually, as well as fighting in compact and quasi-immobile formations. Think about that, right? There was some kind of course, cloth issue, especially what early modern states did was purchasing large quantities of cloth, already dyed, and giving it to the soldiers to eventually tailor that for themselves, right? And these uniforms were also worn out just after a couple of months of campaign. They wouldn't exist anymore. It was basically every army had ever done that. Since we talked about statal armies of some sort, so from Assyrian times, you have a a degree of uniformity to some extent. In fact, I was about to explain this. When you say uniform, you can say, oh well, the first uniform was invented, I don't know, in the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus. No, right? The concept of uniformation, first of all, it did not exist at the time, right? If you want, it did not even exist today, if you're considering absolute uniformity. But it had always existed to some important degree since the dawn of civilization. But in the case of the Landsknechten, that is interesting because they were in many ways recognizable just by their the fact that they were armed and footmen, and of course they had their own insignia. They were recognizable, but especially on the battlefield, as we know, these pike squares were pretty much static. So another factor that would actually increase the necessity of uniform colors for large amounts of people as it emerges in the 18th century is maneuverability. You have to recognize who the hell is on the battlefield. In fact, just we mentioned Gustavus Adolphus. If you look at his colored regiments, they were called like this because in theory at least they should have been all colored and had like major banners like properly identifying themselves on that basis, because there were, say, pitched battles start getting a bit more dynamic from the bulky pike squares of the Renaissance. And so you have to literally find out who's that unit on the battlefield, because you wouldn't easily figure that out, especially considering the chaos, the distance, the smoke, and all that stuff, right? So a Landsknecht could be extremely cocky and again, a dangerous person in many ways, etc. Because on the battlefield, what he had to do was to stand his ground in a traumatically fanatic way, cutting people to pieces, and sort of living a miserable life for which he would have always have to pass to a dagger. And it was completely normal. This is how the soldiery had always been. But the fact that he would bear arms traditionally, that was the first thing in that society. Because in theory, these were the imperial armies, the imperial soldiers, the only ones that truly could fight with that, unless they were part of a commune or the retinue of a nobleman that would have had different insignia. It's a bit like the Cingulum Militaris that we talked about recently, also for the late Roman Empire. I mean, the legionnaire in Rome was recognized just by the fact that he could bear arms, because he lived in a de facto the militarized society otherwise, right? There was no difference between civilians and the military in the way we intend today, because it was also a very violent world. But the right of bearing arms and having, like in the case of the Landsknechts at the time, like this corps recognized as properly the imperial soldiery, was something you would notice extremely in a political and social sense, right? And we'll keep talking about the Landsknechten because they are very fascinating in that self-awareness, by the way, regarding what they had gained through their status, right? And it's even more remarkable as they sank later, which is, it would have been cool to see, Landsknechten surviving as a core historically. But this is also the fate, in fact, of many other units that sort of do not make it, because eventually their social model doesn't make it, their policy doesn't make it, right? Where are the winged hussars? I mean, you can inspire yourself to that, don't get me wrong. In fact, contemporary military bears the name of many, ancestral heroes and units and etc. But of course, that's something that leads to some degree in the culture of a people, and it depends on how it reemerges, how it's reinterpreted, whatever. And surely that's an interesting topic for another video, by the way. But there is always a practicality, right? There is always, as we've seen here, the necessity of even just supplying the troops with this kind of clothing, and it cost a lot, right? Don't think that it was irrelevant. I mean, it was already a lot for these states to even have the money for hiring the soldiers. Issuing them some sort of standard clothing was already per se just a pretty big expense. It's one of the reasons why we think, for example, among the other things, and that the Romans didn't standardize their armies, if not to the level of cohort, and probably also not even that sometimes. This also depends, it's a very important indicator, on the kind of tactical relevance that a unit has. I mean, usually the kind of company level unit is the most tactically relevant. Alright, and as such, it is usually better distinguished by some sort of badges, uniforms, whatever. Consider also the other big point here is that you can even, you can, as we said before, armies, we've seen it in many videos, in early early modern times, were pretty much like they had been since the late Middle Ages. There was a core of mercenaries, then there were some sort of household troops, even of the monarch and the various noblemen, and then you had militias. Right, that's pretty much it. Right, mercenaries become ever more important because, of course, the militias go down after the mid 14th century crisis. So the ancien regime is in many ways the age of mercenaries, and it keeps going on. Even during the 18th century, all those armies weren't technically national as we intend them. The Dutch had practically a purely mercenary army. Right, many troops of, the Frederick the Great's army. Many of them were Prussian, of course. They were levied. We've seen it for the Swedes of Gustavus Adolphus, but it was full of people roaming around. The Prussian army was full of Polish, of other Germans, of Frenchmen, of Italians. We've seen it also in the video about made years ago in the medieval armies of Charles the Bold. Even there, technically French army, but lots of Flemish because of the Burgundian state expansion, lots of Germans, lots of Englishmen, lots of Italians. This could happen in different ways. At the time, for example, there were lots of just allies that would bring troops to fight with you, because this is typical for the Middle Ages, great coalition armies. Right? This lives on in the modern era, but at least there is an attempt to compact more on the basis of these states that are evolving. And one problem still, in fact, in later time, was that these armies were aggregated from so many different places. And so, while these would recognize themselves, were maybe even of common origin, and they had an esprit de corps, they were even there maybe for a valid reason. Mercenaries just were very loyal, some of the most effective ones. Think about the Swiss guards of the Pope or of the French kings. These were people who had themselves been chopped to pieces during the sack of Rome of 1527 by the Landsknecht, literally, and during the French Revolution. These people were really pretty damn good, but again, they were often just very costly, and there was all a market behind them, and they were thus all sort of different units, separated units. How regiments are formed, as you know, is something that starts on a very private basis, right? You're subcontracted the hiring of this unit because the monarch gives you the money to do so as a nobleman, and there is a tradition that is formed on the base of these regiments, especially from the end of the 17th century. Many of these units still exist today, continuing in the history of the national armies. But this is also gradual. But at the time, truly, it was a uniformation of weapons and clothing that really stood out, even though every regiment was colored in a different way, had a different story. But just think in the 16th century, even in the 17th, all the various scarves, swords, knots, the cockades of different types, used especially as in signs of command, telling the truth, but still. Considering the relative tactical simplicity, as we were pointing out before, a blazon had been satisfactory for a long time. I made some videos about late medieval uniforms and say, think about the crosses. Crosses were very common. I've seen them since the Crusades and before, of course, but this stands out in true uniforms for the Franc-archers, for example, the white or red rose for the partisans, of course, respectively, of the Yorks and the Lancasters in the war, in fact, known in the wars, plural, telling the truth, known as the one of the two roses, St. Andrew's cross for the Burgundians, the Bourguignons, during the 100 Years' War. So this was totally normal. Again, made lots of videos. You have, I don't know, at the Battle of Montaperti in 1260, the Ghibellines of Florence, that were exiles at the time, would find enough to display a white cross to distinguish and counterpose themselves to their own Guelph counterparts, the arms of which were a red cross, a vermilion cross. So you see how simple this had been. I'm actually curious to see how many videos I made of that, because I'm sure I've talked this. Some I have to re-upload, and I know that's not actually a very practical thing, but hey, if you look at the playlist here, nothing. It's dress. Neither. Pretty strange. Well, in any case, I don't want to distract you excessively, but I'm also curious about stuff I can address you to, even though I usually show you the top comments. It's definitely dress, and it's because YouTube here is doing other stuff, and no, it's clothes, it's not dress, it's uniform. Yeah, because I condensated them. Had to find, well, yes. Yeah, there is enough there. I remember I had done something specifically about, not so much about late medieval. Alright, there is one about uniforms, but I didn't insert it in this playlist evidently, and it's not a problem. I have to re-upload it anyway, but just for saying, like, you find all these examples. I'm sure I was talking about Montaperti or the St. Andrew's Cross, the Wars of the Roses, the Franc-archers in that video as well. In many ways, as we know, we've seen the watershed in this process was the mid 17th century. If you talk about uniform clothing of some sort, at least to a regimental level, right? With mass society, you have a degree, unprecedented degree of standardization, also because of the industrialization and the capacity of, again, of supplying mass troops with large types of fundamentally standardized, produced weapons to an important degree. But in fact, also by the mid 17th century, you realize that units were pretty similar to one another. I mean, it's difficult even in a contemporary context when soldiers are covered in mud and blood, etc., to simply recognize them. Right? Things get much messier than you think. But it's true that there was some problem there, especially in this starting to distinguish, for example, a nobleman from a commoner, because they looked similar at that point. Authority was recognized. NCOs were, of course, wearing different clothes and were armed in a different way. There was a greater amount of, in fact, of customization, especially for the officers. They could do almost basically what they wanted at that time. Things started to change later. I could realize this. You could, of course, see all the imperfection in this uniforming. Think of how much speculation there was in the subcontracting of clothing and dyeing. and in the supply to the troops of this material, like incredibly messed up, right? But we start finding, especially in the greatest powers of the time, for example, think about the French musketeers. I mean, I was, grown up loving Dumas. The Spanish noble guards, those were also interesting. We'll talk about these sometimes more in depth. These were truly starting to wear a real uniform, right? And in both cases, there was the characteristic jacket / mantle known as cassaque in French, that was ornated with the royal arms, right? And those were hell of units to look. And this surely has to do more with a livret actually than a uniform as we intended in a narrowly modern contemporary sense even, right? These guys had to be recognized in the first place, but they were still considered as, remember it, as some sort of superior freemen to the others, right? That were bound to the ruler, that of course were superior to them in the hierarchy, but they sort of gained the right to bear his arms. That's extremely important. It was a real reward. It was a way of fostering these people through clientele relations, and their lives were also that adventurous and less protected actually from by authority as we think. I mean, if you read the same, musketeers novels, you know that risk was real, right? In that way, you think about Richelieu. Musketeers on their own, those were real, right? They existed, and they did really fight against one another, and for all the complications and the reasons, in spite of the fact that it was France and a unitary power. So the shading of this is what makes it beautiful. So you can find all the historical precedents of the uniform, as many also antiquarianists of a descriptive uniformology really do, right? And it's really interesting to some extent. This is a useful learned discipline, right? We find even in antiquity, actually, this kind of stuff. People were aware of what those symbols really meant, and there is evidently a room in historical research for that sort of parallelism between ancient, modern, and medieval, or even contemporary uniforms, right? So the main step being, however, becoming truly in the second half of the 17th century, the concept of modern uniform is born with the army of Louis XIV, right? That is the first modern army in many ways, because it's a prevalently national army for the first time in history. Like up to the 30 Years' War, there were more mercenaries than soldiers. With Louis XIV, I made a couple of videos about him, and we'll keep talking about his military. The majority of the troops now are truly trained, supplied, armed, etc. by the state, and they are truly French in a national sense, right? They all depend on the monarch at least, in spite of, again, their regiments were subcontracted and all this stuff. But the world at that point sees, and this is because, of course, under Louis XIV, France came back to be the European hegemonic country, continental European hegemonic country. The scale of the necessity of uniforming soldiers of an entire, more than an entire unit, right, in the same way, right? And so this is where we commonly speak of a uniform. In fact, again, there is a debate. Again, the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus is another example, but it all depends on the degree which you're discussing, of how much these troops were meant to be uniform, how much they were actually issued the clothing, how many would actually, how effective that would be on campaign, etc. Right? So it's all very debatable, right? It's not such a big deal. The most important thing is that you remember this timeline more or less, compared to the various eras, which were different, right? So this is what would eventually evolve further as one of those elements that had always existed, constituting discipline, esprit de corps, the tactical and spiritual values in which an army is based. And there are many examples. There is the new model army. There is an advancement in that level of uniformation, and all things that again we will look at in other videos. Hopefully, because I really want to cover them all. I always say hopefully because you may never know what the future brings, but it's surely a goal, and also a pretty obvious one. Here, I don't know what the hell YouTube is doing. Something weird. Whatever. I don't know what is doing this. Sign prop. Why is this the point? Don't ask me anymore what the hell is happening. Something strange going on with YouTube. Never happened. Oh, there's something not going on. I can't see my playlists right now. I hope it's nothing strange. Well, alright, I will update you on this, terrible changes. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.